All right. Thank you. So Paragraphs, the Forgotten Middle is the title of our talk. Now, at first glance, paragraphs may seem almost an embarrassingly literal answer to this implicit question of this conference, which is, between the small and the large objects of DH, between word frequencies and centuries-long historical trends, where's the middle? In paragraphs? Well, our argument here is that paragraphs represent a unique and interesting middle scale of analysis, not because they're literally made up of many smaller units such as words, but in fact because they may transcend those smaller parts. In other words, at the scale of the paragraph, properties of textuality may emerge that would otherwise remain only indirectly visible. In other words, it is more accurately this space of emergence that we want to suggest can be understood as a conceptual middle, a space that we investigate here through the paragraph. This line of investigation follows on our study of sentences, published as our fifth pamphlet, Style at the Scale of the Sentence. Paragraphs and sentences both pose an interesting challenge for the digital humanist. Unlike words, they don't repeat, so we can't study them simply by counting them. Effectively, the type-token ratio of paragraphs in a text is always 1. If we think about it, the fact that words repeat, or the existence of word types, is what allows us to make something like a document term matrix, enabling large-scale quantitative comparisons between text based on the number of tokens of identical word types that different texts share. So without counting them directly, how can we study the paragraph? Well, in our study of sentences, we were able to make a sentence typology in terms of one aspect of their style, that is, their syntactic structures. Sentences of different types turned out to both to have hidden semantic preferences and to create emergent effects of syntactic and narrative suspense. So in setting out to study paragraphs, we initially started out on the same road, style at the scale of the paragraph, as it were. Now, paragraphs are an understudied aspect of prose, but there are some notable works in the stylistics of the paragraph. Auerbach, for instance, began his precursor to mimesis, the essay on the serious imitation of the everyday, with a paragraph from Madame Bovary. His analysis begins, "Dieser Absatz," this paragraph. But in Auerbach, the paragraph usually acts more as a convenient sample of the text, ripe for close reading, than it does as a textual unit in its own right. This inattentiveness to the concept of the paragraph itself ironically continues even in Ian Watt's essay entitled "The First Paragraph of the Ambassadors: An Explication." Watt's essay is an example of early quantitative stylistics. He notices in the paragraph stylistic markers such as non-transitive verbs, delayed specification of reference, abstract nouns, and so on. But to get meta for a second and use quantitative stylistics on Watt's own essay, Watt refers to this paragraph 3 times as a paragraph and 13 times as a passage. This cute statistic only corroborates what's already apparent in the essay, that what Watt finds in this paragraph characterizes for him not so much this paragraph as such, but rather the text as a whole, or possibly even James' entire authorial style. In other words, Watt himself is moving from the very small to the very large, from non-transitive verbs to James' authorial style, letting the paragraph in the process disappear. So in the face of these non-stylistics of the paragraph, we decided to abandon the idea of investigating paragraphs stylistically. After all, what is a paragraph? Historically, the paragraph emerged in Greek manuscripts as a typological marker indicating a particular section of the text had ended. And if stylistics can't explain this sectioning of the text, what can? Well, perhaps another rather important aspect of textuality, its content. In other words, paragraphs may be primarily topical units, or rather than a stylistics of the paragraph, we want to study here its thematics. Now, we can treat this thematic identity of a paragraph as a kind of hypothesis. If paragraphs demarcate sections of the text on a thematic basis, what measurable effects would we expect to see? Well, arguably, we would see some effects measurable by topic modeling. Now, probably many of you already know, but for those who don't, according to one of its original developers, David Bly, topic modeling is a suite of algorithms that uncover the hidden thematic structure in document collections. Effectively, given a large number of documents, topic modeling discovers groups of words that appear in documents together, more often than would be expected by chance. The assumption is that these words appear together for some meaningful reason, and that's why we can call the group of words that they form a topic. So here, for instance, are two topics from another unrelated project in the lab. We have on the first column, eat food, coffee, kitchen table, bread. These words often appear together. We might call it a topic of food words or domestic words. Here are bed, night, sleep, morning, room. Sleep words, kind of nighttime words. The name that we call the topic isn't important, but you can see what I mean. Okay, but how does this look like on the level of the paragraph? Well, if we go back to the paragraph we were just looking at from James' Ambassadors, here's what it looks like when we topic model just that novel. So in color are all the words that were considered by the topic model. In black are common words or names that we left out of the model. Now, the great majority of the colored words in this paragraph belong to one of three topics. Let's look at them really quickly. So in green, we have what I'm calling epistemological words. So Strether has a question, he's learning, his understanding, there's a secret. We have another topic in orange, sort of more pragmatic words that are more plot-oriented. So reaching, the hotel, his friend, the evening. And then lastly, there's sort of a vaguer concept of subjectivity. So Strether is disconcerted. We're talking about the noisiness of the room, his enjoyment, his disappointment, and so on. However, I want to say here that our goal in this talk is not so much to parse the content of topics in paragraphs, but rather to investigate the structuring effects they may have. For instance, in this paragraph, there appear to be three dominant topics. In effect, we might call this a tri-topical paragraph. This is interesting because if paragraphs really are demarcated topically, then we should expect to see this type of phenomenon often, something we might call its topical focus. A paragraph should be about one to a few different topics, but not about every topic in the text. We can even measure the extent to which particular paragraphs are topically focused. Many statistical measures of concentration exist, many of which are developed in the discipline of economics. For instance, Ginny's measure of wealth inequality or Herfindahl's measure of market concentration. In our context, both of these statistical measures effectively calculate the extent to which the words in the paragraph are concentrated into the hands of a few or a single, the single or a few number of topics. So with these statistical measures, we can ask this question: are fictional paragraphs really more topically focused than random slices of text would be? And in order to answer this question, we created a little experiment here. Here we have the same corpus. We have 19 Bildungsroman novels, all published between 1840 and 1880. We decided to give a literary historical focus to this experiment to sort of bracket out changes in literary history. Instead, the primary difference here is the way in which we've created documents. And I think the PowerPoint is a little bit messed up, but that's okay. So in this, in the first version of the model, we consider as documents the actual paragraphs of the text. In the second version of the model, we consider as a document 82 word slices. And we used 82 because that's the average length of a paragraph in this corpus. And in the third, we're using 200 word slices just to go up. So we ran all of these models and then calculated the topical focus of each document using these measures of concentration, like Ginny and Herfindahl. And the result? Paragraphs are statistically significantly more focused than other types of textual slices. We think this has an important theoretical implication about the relationship between a text and its thematics. Where are themes in a text? In a sense, in paragraphs. By concentrating themes within themselves, paragraphs can be said to act as the habitat of themes in a text. But let's look at some examples. What does focus really mean in a fictional context? Not all fictional paragraphs are topically focused, but if the textual unit of the paragraph is the most focused of possible textual slices, perhaps focused paragraphs perform some kind of thematic or narrative work in a text that would be important to uncover. So we read through a number of highly focused paragraphs, and we found that their focus seems to derive from a number of recurring reasons, and I'll talk about 4 of them here. The first 2 I'll briefly mention. So the first is the least interesting. It's what we're calling idiolect. These are paragraphs of dialogue, usually written in either a regional or a class-based dialect, or in some different language altogether. So maybe some character speaks French, and that's why that paragraph appears more focused, because the topic that dominates it is French words. The second is more interesting, but this is sort of what we would expect. So these are paragraphs of description that say introduce a character, and because they may use adjectives that often appear together, such as fair and beautiful and attractive, they are also focused because most of the words are taken up by that topic. But let's look more closely at the last two. This is a very interesting one of suspense. Here's an example from Villette. So this is a more interesting cause of topical focus. More generally, we could call this effect something like narrative concentration. In this paragraph from Villette, precisely one event occurs. The bell has finally rung, and Rosine opens the door to speak with the admitted guest. Consequently, the paragraph is dominated by a topic of words indicating Rosine's intense attention given to the sound of the arrival. Rang, loud, cautious tinkle, metal whisper. And to another cluster of domestic words narrating and orchestrating that arrival. So cabinet, open, person, admitted, and stood. So that's the third type. And then lastly, to go on to this fourth type, this is a parallel of narrative concentration that we're calling characterization because it involves more interiority than it does action. In this Middlemarch paragraph, the narrator explains the psychological context for Will's waspish reply to Lydgate. The fact was that, et cetera, et cetera. Much like the opening paragraph of the Ambassadors, two topics coordinate this explanation. A topic of epistemological words, such as fact, concession, hint, concluded, what's going on in Will's mind, and a topic of subjective reaction words, such as susceptible and indignant, regarded and imagined. So those are those last examples, and I think, Mark, yep.
So the concept of focus has allowed us to take a look at what paragraphs do internally. That is, if paragraphs are the unit of the text in which topics reside, then the measure of focus allows us to witness what each one does as a discrete textual unit. But what happens when we move to looking at paragraphs in and of themselves and start looking at what happens when paragraphs change? That is, when we move from one paragraph to the next. The position of paragraphs within a text, we want to argue, is not arbitrary. They follow each other in a specific sequence, and based on what we've seen in terms of focus, the logic of that sequence, we argue, lies at the level of the topic. This leads us to examining the boundaries between paragraphs through the lens of topicality, and ultimately to the concept of paragraphs transitions, or what we are calling discontinuity between paragraphs. In other words, to back up, the paragraph break is non-neutral. The shifting of topics, whether thematic or modal, is itself the logic of paragraph transition. When a text transitions from a discussion on a single topic to another discussion on a different topic, then the typographical marker that announces this shift is the paragraph break. Two such paragraphs following each other in sequence should offer a mix of topics in different compositions. By looking at the specific ways in which actual paragraphs are topically discontinuous, therefore, we are able to gather valuable information on how both this discontinuity works between individual paragraphs and, more importantly, how these sequences of adjacent paragraphs come together to structure the text as a whole. Like focus, we can measure discontinuity through the results of our topic model experiment. For each pair of sequential paragraphs, we have the mixture of topics in each one, and more importantly, the posterior probabilities of each topic in both paragraphs. We can use these posterior probabilities, therefore, to measure a simple Euclidean distance between each pair of paragraphs. Two paragraphs that are highly focused and which have no topical overlap should have a high distance between them and thus be highly discontinuous, while two less focused paragraphs that are about the same thing with the same mixture of topics in the same proportions should be closer and therefore more continuous. If we compare this metric calculated between paragraphs to the same metric, sequence of corpora calculated between sequential slices of 82 words and 200 words, we again find that paragraphs are far more discontinuous than either of the other two ways of dividing the text. This makes sense. If paragraph breaks are occasioned by the shifting of topical focus, then sequential slices, which divide the text within paragraphs, should have a much higher probability of having the same topics in the same proportions. Again, paragraphs reveal themselves to be the habitat of topics within the text. While there are a number of possible reasons that two paragraphs could exhibit a discontinuous break between their thematic or topical features, for example, switches in language or ideograms, as Ryan suggested, meaningful discontinuities tend to fall into four dominant categories that we think are linked to the narrative or dialogic functions of the text. Shifts in narrative perspective, for example, the narration switching between characters or settings. Shifts in narrative specification, or changes in the distance of narration. I'll explain those two in more depth in a minute. Causal relations, or the movement between cause and effect. Here, the first paragraph typically narrates the cause of an action that then follows in the subsequent paragraph. And topical multiplication. This often occurs when a highly focused paragraph is followed by one which describes additional aspects, examples, or consequences, or which contextualizes the single topic of that first paragraph within the text as a whole. Of these, I want to focus on the first two, shift in narrative perspective. First, here the example is taken from Adam Bede. The monotopical first paragraph is focused primarily on Bede's movement through nature, towards the house. In the second paragraph, the narrative shifts to a description of Adam's mother, Lisbeth, as she waits for Adam to arrive. The change here is symmetrical. The first paragraph is active, reflecting Adam's movement. The second is passive, reflecting Lisbeth's position within the house. The first describes Adam by his action. The second offers a catalog of Lisbeth's physicality and interiority. Second, shifts in specification. In this example, two paragraphs from Coningsby, there's a topical continuity between the two paragraphs. Both draw relatively heavily from topic number 22, which is logical given their shared theme of horses. But here, there's a change in what we might call the narrative speculation, related to what Todorov describes as distance in his 1965 discussion of narrative mode. While the first describes in the abstract the set of rules and protocols in place for any given horse race, the second contextualizes that specific race in the text within the narrative experience of the characters. That is, the narrative mode moves from abstract description to concrete action within the text, from a wide but distant overview, delivering critical information to the reader, to a series of actions that take place within the chronotope of these characters in this text, or in this place. Within and between paragraphs, therefore, there is a clear relationship between the paragraph as a textual unit that lies between the word and the text, and the topic as the unit of the theme. The two metrics that we have isolated from this relationship, focus and discontinuity, can be characterized, as we've tried to do, in the relationship to the words of the paragraph. That is, certain words, as certain members of certain topical groups, reveal how these two metrics structure paragraphs taken individually and in pairs. But to return to the theme of the paper and the conference as a whole, this demonstrates the relationship of the middle, the paragraph, to the small, the word. What is unique about paragraphs as we've reconceived them, however, is that they also have a separate relationship to the large, the text. That is, the two metrics we describe are specific to the level of the paragraph. Although influenced by the language of the text, they are not reducible to the words themselves as individual features. In the relationship to the text, therefore, we want to argue that paragraphs themselves are features. Features whose unique characteristics can help us understand the structure of both texts and things larger than texts, corpora, or genres. We want to present two potential ways that we can use paragraphs as features to explore the structure of these large-scale objects. One that extends the emphasis placed on order and sequence that we've seen in our use of discontinuity to the fictional text as a whole, and one that uses both focus and discontinuity together to explore the relationship of, in this case, fiction, conceived through the Bildungsroman, to other kinds of non-fictional writing. As we've seen, the sequence of paragraphs within a text does important topical work. A change from one paragraph to another is an occasion for a change in the topical mix between them, some of which are more discontinuous than others. And this relationship continues as we move beyond paragraph pairs to the order of paragraphs within a text. If we imagine each paragraph in terms of its topicality, that is, if it is monotopical, bitopical, tritopical, all the way up to polytopical, how does the order of these different kinds of paragraphs have structural effects within the text? And given that we actually have data on paragraphs in this way, can we in effect sequence texts? This graph effectively attempts to do just that, in that it is a graph of the sequence of paragraphs in Eliot's The Mill on the Floss. And also, as a side note, the plot itself is based on a destruct plot, or a description of structure plot, used in human genetic mixture analyses. Each bar represents a paragraph in the text, and the colors of each bar represent its topicality on what we might consider to be a heat-based scale. The bluer the bar, or the darker blue the bar, the more monotopical the paragraph, or the fewer topics it contains. And the redder the bar, the more topics it contains, the more polytopical it is. This lets us do two things with text visualized in this way. First, we can look at sequences of paragraphs. For example, how often do paragraphs of each type occur after each other, and do their sequences form patterns within the narrative as a whole? And secondly, this also allows us to take the temperature of the graph. By looking at how red or blue the novel is overall, and within specific sequences, we can draw conclusions about how monotopical or polytopical a specific part of a novel or even a whole novel might be. If we compare a graph of Eliot to our graph of Phineas Finn by Trollope, it becomes immediately apparent that the Trollope novel is by far the more polytopical. Moreover, there seem to be macro-scale bands of mono and polytopicality that indicate potentially important sequences of these paragraphs within the novel. If we fade out everything but the strictly mono and polytopical paragraphs, that is, paragraphs in which one topic has a posterior probability of over 50%, and what we're calling polytopical paragraphs are those in which more than five posterior probabilities of topics are needed to add up to 50% of the whole. This pattern becomes even clearer. And the importance of polytopical paragraphs in the Trollope novel is even more apparent. Finally, as a last gesture along this sequence, if we instead reorder the bars so that instead of reflecting the actual sequence of paragraphs, we group paragraphs of the same topicality level together, it becomes strikingly apparent that well over a quarter of the paragraphs in Phineas Finn are polytopical. Equally as interesting, at least to me, is that although far smaller numerically, the monotopical paragraphs by proportion in Phineas Finn are actually still bigger than those of Eliot. We might consider, as we research this more, that Phineas Finn might be more topically extreme. It's worth noting again that here we're not using words in the traditional way used by digital humanities. We're not using words directly in the analysis. Rather, we're using the metrics of the paragraphs themselves as the set of features. These recent results offer an alternative direction for our work on paragraphs, and one that we'll be exploring more as this project progresses in the future. But I want to turn to the other potential direction of thinking through paragraphs as features. That is, comparisons between what we might consider to be genres of writing. What these results suggest in their implications of the importance of order and sequence is that there is a relationship between topicality and narrativity, the aspect of the text in whose domain is order and sequence. But if this is the case, then what does it tell us about how our metrics of focus and discontinuity operate in fiction, and by extension, in non-fictional texts? Accordingly, we selected two other genres to compare against our Bildungsroman corpus, sampled for length so that there was the same number of words in each genre, and also sampled from the same time span. First, biography, which purports to be nonfiction, yet which is still narrative in nature. If, for example, our metric of discontinuity has meaning as a paragraph feature, then the order and transition between paragraphs in narrative and non-narrative contexts, we argue, should be different. Secondly, we chose a sample of non-biographical nonfiction, including a text from a very diverse range, from, as you can see, the description of the skeleton of an extinct gigantic sloth, all the way to my personal favorite, Pessimism, a History and a Criticism. Our goal for this experiment was twofold. First, by calculating both the focus and discontinuity scores across the paragraphs of both genres, as we did across the different kinds of slices in our first experiment, we can begin to witness how topics and, in fact, paragraphs behave differently in fiction than they do in other kinds of writing. Secondly, and perhaps more importantly, this once again offers us an opportunity to test the relationship of our proposed middle to the whole. In our analysis of genre, in other words, our feature set is composed of metrics that are native to the paragraph and not decomposable to the level of the word. If our experiment can cluster texts, it will cluster them meaningfully by the middle, by paragraphs themselves. A plot of the discontinuity scores across our three kinds of writing reveals differences that, while not as stark as our previous results, are still highly statistically significant. These indicate that fictional paragraphs have less discontinuity than those of other genres, fiction being the orange line on the bottom, bio the blue in the middle, and green the bar at the top. Fully 65% of our fictional paragraph pairs have a lower discontinuity score and are thus more continuous than the median of either nonfiction or biography. Although the difference appears slighter on the graph, biography is also statistically significantly less discontinuous than nonfiction. Clearly, the shift in genres of writing affects the way in which paragraphs are sequenced. Given the way in which non-fictional texts order information, that is, non-narratively, the result is perhaps not as surprising as our previous conclusions. What is more interesting, however, is the kind of paragraph transition that is most frequently found in non-fiction. Our hypothesis was that nonfiction should feature sequences of highly focused monotopical paragraphs whose lack of narrative continuity would result in higher discontinuity scores. What we found, however, is that almost all of the most discontinuous pairs of paragraphs tended to fall into a category that we've already seen in the fictional texts. That is, shifts with specification, or as they reveal themselves here, shifts in narrative level from abstract to specific and from specific to abstract. In this example, taken from the history of the war with Russia, we see a polytopical paragraph on the left, followed by a monotopical paragraph on the right. It's worth noting in this case that here, the polytopical paragraph, really mostly bi, but still poly, is much shorter than the monotopical paragraph, which was one of the things we checked first. There isn't a strong correlation between those two, that is, between length and topicality. The two topics that are most operative in the first paragraph include words like time, present, place, number, character, subject in the first topic, and in the second large topic, life, men, people, heart, and country. These are clearly abstract topics dealing with large ideas about war. In the second, the primary topic, enemy, troops, attack, French, wounded, returns us from the abstract and general to the concrete and specific. If the first paragraph narrates how different groups respond to the horrors of war in general, then the second reveals the contingencies of this war in Russia fought by, for example, Sir John Campbell and Sir George Brown. Across all of the texts, the most highly discontinuous paragraphs feature this shift in narrative level, from the abstract idea to the specific instance, or from the specific instance to the abstract idea. Unlike in fiction, where it was only one of many possible types of discontinuity, this type of shift appears to be dominant in nonfiction and tells us something about how non-fictional paragraphs are sequenced. It remains, however, to see if focus can perhaps tell us something more. Dun, dun, dun.
So we just saw that non-fictional paragraphs are more discontinuous in their paragraph transitions than fictional ones. Are they also more focused? And we can cut to the chase. If we look at this plot, indeed they are, and by an even wider margin. So at the bottom, Bildungsroman are representative of fiction. We have the biography next, and then nonfiction. So there's a wider margin, but the order between these discourses has remained the same. Repeating the sampling process we made for discontinuity, we read a sample of highly focused paragraphs, and again, found among them many of the same functions as we had found for fiction, including for biography, even moments of suspense. However, in almost every case, the greater analytical thrust of the non-fictional material allowed similar functions for focused paragraphs to operate at even greater extremes. So, for instance, here is a paragraph of description from the appropriately named text, Description of the Skeleton of an Extinct Gigantic Sloth, in which all 30 of its words are given over to a single topic of skeletons. In fiction, this situation would be hard to imagine. Even in paragraphs of description, other topics inevitably appear, at least marginally within the paragraph, interweaving description with narrative, subjectivity, commentary, or other narratological functions. By the way, and this is the case even if we topic model each text separately. That is, the greater focus and discontinuity of non-fictional texts is not simply owing to the fact that the topical difference between non-fictional texts is greater, although this is also true. Even internally to the text, non-fictional paragraphs are both more focused and more discontinuous than fictional ones. So, if we turn to our last slide, a focus on the x-axis and discontinuity on the y, and Bildungsroman texts are in blue, biography in orange, and nonfiction in yellow, and the size of the circle is actually the number of paragraphs within a certain length. So this graph isn't owing to the fact that fictional paragraphs tend to be shorter, so there's no length correlation here. We can see how well these two emergent properties of paragraphs separate these three genres of prose writing, showing again how operant the middle can be on the scale of the large. So, to back up, what have we learned? We were able to study paragraphs which do not repeat quantitatively by operationalizing two aspects of their topical form, their internal focus and their transitional continuity. It turns out that paragraphs are more focused and more discontinuous than other textual divisions, like random slices of the text, showing that paragraphs really are topical entities. Consequently, we can say that paragraph divisions are, at the same time, topical divisions in a text. Or conversely, that topics inhere in texts via their paragraphs. It's as if paragraphs mediate the thematic expression of a text. Highly focused paragraphs turn out to do things in narrative. They create moments of description, suspense, and characterization. Highly discontinuous paragraph transitions also do things in narrative. They shift narrative perspective and mode, and reveal narrative causality. But in a final twist, paragraphs are even more topically defined in nonfiction than in fiction. Non-fictional texts are both more rigidly defined into topics, and these topical divisions are more rigidly expressed by paragraphs. So finally, we may have arrived at the ironic conclusion that narrativity and topicality may to some degree conflict. Narrativity may impose demands on a text that run counter to the demands of topicality. To tell a story may, in fact, imply a degree of topical continuity throughout a text, just as it implies a degree of topical diversity. Even highly analytical authors, such as George Eliot and Henry James, interleave within their paragraphs of description or explanation other topics, revealing, for instance, matters of subjectivity and interiority, in addition to the details of the objects described. Finally, we've seen that paragraphs are more than a simple typographical middle between words and texts. Rather, paragraphs can conceptually and methodologically mediate between the small and the large in digital humanities research, mitigating the theoretical vertigo between these two radically disparate scales of analysis. Although made up of words, paragraphs exhibit emergent and important properties of textuality, structuring the thematics of a text, and even distinguishing between different discourses of writing. In the end, it is this double-endedness of the paragraph, both emergent on the smaller scales while operating independently on its larger ones, that makes it a powerful example of the middle. As we've tried to demonstrate, we believe that digital humanities research is most powerful, both theoretically and methodologically, when it operationalizes its concepts from the existing ontology of literary theory.